participants and to many of the migrant workers who are Muslims. I'll be using the word migrant workers. Sometimes it will become foreign workers depending on speakers and participants. So now to some technical details. All participants, welcome. Please mute your audios. Everyone, mobile phones on mute too. Participants, please, no cameras allowed. I hope you understand. No recording, please. MARUAH, as the organizer, with the help of our technical support group, ShapeC, we will be recording this event and will make it available. Speakers will be, and the format will be 3 parts. Part 1, panel speakers will share their views, 4 of them. Part 2, discussions. I'm sorry if you hear the wonderful birds outside, it's great. Part 3, question and answer from you all. You have a chat box there. Please send in the questions. Our host, whom you would see on your screen as ShapeC, they are helping us to host this event, and they will cluster the questions and will pass it to me. And during question time, I will share the questions. If you want to be identified in your question, please put down your name, then it will be articulated by your name. Otherwise, it will be just a general question. A question without a name, And all reporters, if you are in the room, welcome. Please identify yourself as you put up your chat questions. The speakers, let me introduce the speakers first. Then the next part is I will share my thoughts, and then it will be open to the plenary speakers. Mr. Alex Au will be back soon. He's the Vice President of Transient Workers Count 2. He has worked in the corporate sector and he joined TWC2, Transient Workers Count 2, in 2011. He's prominent in Singapore's LGBT movement, a socio-political commentator and human rights activist. At TWC2, Alex has special responsibility for a number of portfolios that he carries on. And one of the more interesting things is case management systems and data. Next is Dr. Satveer Kaur, who is an academic at NUS Chua Tian Po Community Leadership Center. Dr. Kaur's current research interests are in making sense of health disparities faced by marginalized populations, that is, low-skilled migrant workers and low-income Singaporeans. She examines the communicatively centered structural factors that limit access to health justice for marginalized communities. Next, we have Dr. Imran bin Tajudeen, who is a senior research fellow at the Department of Architecture, NUS, and a Mutawa fellow at Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. He works on the framing and articulation of urban heritage as an arena of public culture in Singapore and Southeast Asia, and its contemporary representational tropes as shaped by colonial and naturalist frames. In this area, he's very interested in looking at how dormitories, he's doing continuing research on dormitories and looking at all the factors that influence the design, the architectural approaches to the design of dormitories, and that is what we are hoping he would be kindly sharing with us. Next is Ms. Jaya Anil Kumar. She is the case manager at Humanitarian Organization for Migration Economics, often called HOME. In our minds, we all know HOME. And Jaya oversees the casework relating to migrant domestic workers and provides them advice and guidance on their rights. She's trained in law. She's a lawyer. Next, therefore, we come to what are we here for, you, me, and the speakers. Oh, the virus, right? As we already know quite a lot about the virus and still do not know a lot, it is non-discriminatory, It is hardy. It survives on a lot of surfaces up to a period of maybe even 72 hours. So the probabilities for infections are very high. If I live alone, it's me and my surfaces. If I live with others and many others, it is many surfaces in a small space, or if I'm better off in a bigger house, but it is still surfaces, and wiping down and sanitizing will become the norm. Has it been the norm for many of us? And if we say that all this is hindsight, perhaps we need to look at it by the science that was known at that time. Were we not really and fully understanding the nature of the virus in that it is non-discriminatory? What type of worker are you? What type of a person are you? It doesn't care what ethnicity, what religious group, what race, what ideologies you follow, and where you live, your age. It is just looking for the host. That means all of us as human beings are vulnerable to being infected by the virus. That is what we need to get into, the whole spectrum of everything, and everyone has been saying it, but I think sometimes the non-discriminatory nature, I think we have to really absorb it into our system. Next part, in this whole forum, there are some limitations. There are other vulnerable communities, Singaporeans who live in as many residents in the flat, care homes, prisons, shelters, residential homes. Please keep them in mind in terms of the pandemic, but for this moment, we are here to talk about migrant workers. So what then about migrant workers? The numbers in the dorms, just one moment, please. Can you all see this? Is this visible? Okay, these are the numbers of work permit holders that we have. These are figures that go up to 2019. I'm trying to, can you see 2019, please? Can you all see 2019? You can't. Okay, these are the rough numbers of the people that we have in terms of foreign domestic workers and in terms of work permit. The numbers, I think it will be elaborated further by our speakers. Then if I were to look at what are the latest data from the Ministry of Health and Government SG, right? You would see, I'm just trying to look for full screen, just one moment. Sorry, excuse me. Yeah, if you can look, this is the number of infection cases, etc., taken from CNA website. The latest from the Ministry of Health, I've highlighted what I just want to point out in red, residing outside dormitories, but vulnerability is there, and the number of persons in critical condition, etc., and the COVID testing. Total swabs done is 143,990. And this one in green, total unique persons swabbed, 99,000. I've put it in green because I couldn't find exactly what that means. But if these are the number of swab tests done, then look at the number of workers that we have. I think these are important discussions. So coming back then to the last part of what I would like to say for migrant workers, that we are, so many steps have taken place, from dislocation to displacement to rehousing, so that we improve the system for migrant workers. We also have to bear in mind their basic human rights from the time that they came onto our shores, their food, their health, their sanitation, shelter, money, communication approaches, reassurance. What have they done? Migrant workers have contributed plenty in terms of remittances to their own country, to us in terms of levies that they have given probably to our consolidated funds, and also in terms of improving personal livelihoods, etc. So we have woken up quite a lot because of the pandemic. We are now at a stage of a new order from this disorder. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has valued and appreciated the migrant workers and telling us that things will not be the same again. So what then is the new global order? What is the new national order? What are we going to do about our current laws? Will we have an anti-discrimination law? What about social protection? So for that, we have our experts on the ground, people who are researching, people who are the support structures and the advocacy groups for migrant workers. And so we will begin with our first person, and that is Mr. Alex Au. Thank you. Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Braema. Thank you. All right, so we've had a lot of discussions lately about dormitories. And indeed, it is true that the vast majority of the more recent new cases have been of people residing in worker dormitories. But I think we're at the risk of over-narrowing the conversation to dormitories, which is why I think we should take this opportunity now to talk a little wider than just dormitories. So I'm going to start to share a PowerPoint here, if you don't mind. And how do I, so let's go. Right. So actually the topic I have is that the dorms are not just the only problem we have. Okay, there's much more than that. Now it is a well-known fact that, of course, the dorms make a big difference to our numbers. Just look at this. These are the top 10 countries. When I say country, it means population, and they are ranked by the total cases per million. And you can see that Singapore is number 8. We're actually very high. So if for a little country that likes to be ranked highly in the world, there we are. But you will notice something interesting. Qatar is also up there. And Qatar's problem is very similar to ours. Although I don't have exact statistics from Qatar exactly as to how many or what percent are from their worker dormitories, I've seen news reports that talk that the overwhelming majority or the great majority of Qatar's cases are also from worker dormitories. So that really tells you that the dormitories are indeed a problem. That said, however, I would argue that the dormitories are just a symptom of the problem. They're not the problem per se. Okay, especially now when we're talking about diseases, we really should make a distinction between the symptoms and the underlying problem. While it is true that the density is the immediate factor that makes for a high transmission rate, we should then also go back and ask ourselves, why did we even choose to house migrant workers in such density in the first place? Because we need to reflect on the decisions we've made leading up to this, and the result is what we see today. Let me move on to the next slide. Okay, I would argue that Singapore tends to see economics as a zero-sum game. And there is maybe an unstated assumption among all of us that cheap foreign labor is good for us because when they are cheap, we can extract more wealth and therefore we get richer. So if this is the underlying principle that we go by, then we will always have cheap foreign labor because we will never want to be poorer, would we? Right? So this is where we are. And if we have this addiction to cheap labor, what would be the consequences? We're talking about dorm improvements, but you know, there's going to be a limited upside. We're going to find that it's going to cost money to make dorm improvements. And if we go by the principle that, you know, the cheaper they are, the better for us, then I think there's a certain limit to what Singaporeans will stomach as the costs to bear to improve the situation. So we must be very cognizant of our own limitations in terms of the way we think. So, yeah, so the dorms are not a problem. Fine, okay, good. These are the issues that transient workers come to social workers deal with pre-COVID, all right? I want you to look for the word dorms. Do the workers complain about dorms? Where on earth in this whole constellation of problems that they phone us and they tell us about and they come and they say, help me with this, help me with that, where do they talk about their dorms and the conditions in their dorms? We actually find almost none of them would mention dorms. In fact, a lot of that has got to do with money and with medical care, because when they are sick or injured, they can't work, and therefore it's a money problem. So why don't they talk about dorms? Well, does that mean that they are happy? No, they're not. Okay, we know that they are not happy. But see, from the worker's point of view, if I complain about dorms, then I'll just make my employer unhappy. And then what will the employer do? He will cancel my work permit and I lose my job. So what's the point of complaining about dorms? I just live with it. I just put up with it. That is the calculation they have. That's why they don't talk about dorms, even though the housing conditions are actually quite unsatisfactory. That said, I must admit that these purpose-built dorms, at least, are an improvement over what existed before, like 20 years ago, when they kind of like crammed themselves in all sorts of apartments and rooms that they could rent. But still, the dorms remain crowded places, and they are obviously a vulnerability, as we know now. Okay, after COVID, what has been the issues raised? What have been the issues raised by foreign workers in the last couple of weeks? Well, here they are. Again, they're mostly complaining about salary issues. All right, with a big new one on the right-hand side, confusion regarding the salary entitlement. The simple question they ask is, where is my $750? Why? They heard the government announce that the government is going to give $750 to the employers in order to benefit the workers. How do the workers interpret it? Well, the boss should give me my $750, so why is it not coming? So these are the big issues. Again, look for the word dorm. How many of them are complaining about dorms? That's very interesting. Again, they're not complaining about dorms. Our media are writing about dorms. Yeah, Singaporeans are talking about dorms. Certainly our ministers are talking about dorms, but the workers are not really talking very much about that. They're talking about money all over again. Money for the phone, all right? Money to rent if they're staying outside in the rooms because they have no more income now because they can't work. So these are the issues, of which, let me go back to the issues pre-COVID. Yeah, and I want you to point out something here, which are the exorbitant agents' fees. They pay a lot. There are demands for payment to renew their work permits, and there are unreasonable salary deductions. What are the effects of all this? The effects of all this is that it lowers a payroll cost for the employer. Okay, the employer basically takes $10,000 from the worker before the worker starts work. And then the employer pays a few $100s in salary. Effectively, the employer has no payroll costs for a year or 2 years of their workers' employment. Because the workers are in debt, they don't want to lose a job because then they will have to pay their money lenders back home. The workers become very subservient to the boss. So the boss can bully them, can ask for very unsafe working conditions. Can ask for excessive overtime and then maybe not pay for the overtime. The boss is also able to lower his bids for contracts. And the result is that when unethical employers engage in these practices, they actually are in a stronger competitive position to win contracts. Now, not all employers are unethical. In fact, most employers, I would say, are ethical. But it really makes them hard to compete when you have unethical employers free to do what they do. This is the landscape that we are dealing with. And the landscape is not just a question of bad employers. We also have a regulatory system a total ecosystem that basically encourages the subservience of foreign workers and their low wages. For example, we have rules that foreign workers cannot change jobs except in some very narrow conditions, and that Singapore obviously has no minimum wage that is applicable to them. There's also regulatory neglect. We spoke about recruitment fees, renewal money, unreasonable deductions, and there's very weak enforcement of these things. So, for example, we will hear, no doubt, from the government that, oh, no. You know, all the employment agents in Singapore are regulated. But TWC2 did a survey a few years ago, and we found that 60% of recruitments were done through unregulated agents, unlicensed agents. The licensed agents only managed to transact about 40% of the recruitments into the construction and related sectors. All right, 60% of the recruitments were done by unlicensed agents who obviously don't have to deal with fee caps and all that kind of thing. But in the same conversation today, be very careful. We're going to be talking about dormitories, but be careful. There are 43 licensed dormitories, but we must also bear in mind that not all workers live in licensed dormitories. Another 100,000 workers live in unlicensed dormitories. So Singapore actually has a habit of under-regulation that tends to breed the kinds of conditions we see today. And this has a direct impact on disease. For example, here's what happens. A worker pays recruitment costs, $10,000 to get a job with a basic salary of only $400 a month. It will take him about 25 months to pay off that recruitment cost. He's in debt. He knows he absolutely cannot afford to lose the job. So now the boss becomes unreasonable. He says, look, workers cannot be absent. The moment you're absent, I'm going to dock your wages for the day. I'm going to impose a further fine on you. So the worker cannot resist unreasonable demands like this. And yet when he falls sick, he won't dare go to the doctor. Even if he dared, no money to see a doctor because wages are so low. He has no savings. So what does he do? He goes to work while symptomatic. Do you remember that when the government issues COVID statistics, there's always a little bit there at the bottom that says work site transmission. So it doesn't only happen in the dorms, it happens at work sites. So we feel that you can see here how the abuses in the overall ecosystem leads to infection transmission. This is what it might have been. We could have a low number of cases, suffered a little bit of economic damage. Some months down the road, the cases will mostly be gone from Singapore and we can resume our economic growth. Yet, this is what's happening now, isn't it? Lots and lots of cases, major lockdown, from 1 month extended to 2 months. Possibly there'll be a very slow easing of the lockdown. So there's going to be continued economic damage as we basically stall our economy. So it's like this. So we save money by having cheap labor. But what is now the effect? We're going to lose a lot of money because of the economic damage that results from having a system of, foreign workers that are not well treated, that are basically abused left and right. Dorms are not a problem. And so if we want to benefit from the lessons of COVID-19, we need to address the root causes. We shouldn't only deal with dormitories because, the thing is this, the next crisis is not likely to be another pandemic. It's going to be something else that's going to hit us out of the blue when we least expect it. And it's likely to spring from another aspect of our cheap labor model. Oh, we think that, these things don't happen to us. Singapore's a lovely place, good governance, blah, blah, blah. But you never know how the world changes and how the expectations of the world changes. For example, Thailand was hit a few years ago with a European Union suggesting that there should be a ban on Thailand seafood exports because of the human rights abuses in the seafood industry of Thailand. Okay, so Thailand had to quickly improve its recruitment and labor management in this sector. Otherwise, they would face a loss of export income. We have to examine the whole economic model. All right, okay, maybe it's not seafood for us, but you know what? Shipping companies are now getting concerned about the way our shipyards deal with labor. and the human rights abuses in our shipyards, including salary misrepresentation and non-payment and so forth. So that's a major export. The big petroleum companies who put contracts to our shipyards for barges and oil rigs, they're getting concerned about labor issues. Now, so we have this whole economic model which we must re-examine, okay? We have the whole principle that cheap exploited foreign labor equals prosperity for us. And we have an ecosystem that basically supports that. Our foreign workers cannot change jobs, so they cannot stand up to abusive and unreasonable bosses. And we say, no, Singapore cannot afford to have a minimum wage, because if we did that, our economy will probably suffer badly or even just collapse. But hold on, wait a minute. There are these first world countries with pretty good economies and good living standards for their citizens. Their minimum wage applies to migrant workers as well. Migrant workers also enjoy the minimum wage in their countries. Okay, there's leakage. There are bad employers even in those countries that will try to escape from the law and so forth. But on the whole, at least the state takes this point of view that the minimum wage applies to them. And look at the minimum wages here. How come they can afford such standards when we say we absolutely cannot? Oh, somebody will turn around, will say, excuse me, but you know, say employers might turn around and say, look, you know, foreign workers are not cheap. You know, if you take the basic pay and then we have to add some more to pay for the dormitory, and then we have to pay the massive levy to the government, it's $1,500 per worker. It's roughly equivalent to, you know, what Japan, Korea, and Germany cost, the cost of a worker in those countries. Yeah, but look at it. Look at this graph in a different way now. I want you to look at it in a different way, seriously. Assume that the 1,500 is equivalent to income for the worker, right? Because for Singaporean workers, we don't have a levy, all right? So this is the, let's say this is the total package for the worker. Effectively, the levy is a form of income tax that's being paid by the worker, although indirectly via the employer. This is a low income worker, you know, in a relatively low skilled job, and he's paying an effective tax rate of 47%. That's what it really means here, all right? And his take home pay is only a third of the total cost to his employer. So I'm going to finish very quickly. Let's go back and think now. Why are we only talking about dorms? I would ask everyone here to talk about the bigger issues, because the dorms are just a manifestation of the fundamental problem. They are not the problem in themselves. Alone, they won't solve, fixing dorms alone won't solve anything, okay? My concern is that we're really only talking about dorms, not because we care so much about the migrant workers, but we really care about our international image and how it has been tarnished. And so, yes, we have to fix the dorms because now the whole world are sharing pictures and videos of our dorms. So we better do something to put lipstick on our pig. But my fear is that once we do something to the dorms, whatever little we do, we're just going to go back to business as usual. And I don't know whether this is the right thing for Singapore in the longer term. Thank you so much.
Alex, thank you very much. I think you gave a wonderful systemic structure and on the supply chains, on how it impacts the migrant workers, and who are we as Singapore? Are we first world? Then if so, what should we do for the midterm to the long term? It cannot go back to the same way. So thank you very much. Dr. Satveer Kaur, over to you.
Very good morning. Thank you so much, Alex, for that presentation. Good morning to everyone. So what I'll be speaking on today is thinking about how can we co-create solutions, but with migrant worker voices at the center of the solutioning. So the reason why I have shaped the title of my slide this way is because I hope that this will be one of the key takeaways from my presentation. So I think Alex has wonderfully laid out the structural conditions of labor that ultimately, not just the dorm alone, but the neoliberal management of migrant workers is a structural condition of labor that amplifies health. And here I want to point out that when we think about migrant worker health, we cannot divorce structural conditions when thinking about their health. So all of these disparities, structural disparities, whether they lie in the nature of employment, employment management, housing, sanitation, food, are ultimately connected to migrant worker health. And that's where we are seeing now the nature of outbreak inequality taking place in relation to migrant workers, because what we are seeing is that there are certain groups more marginalized in the process due to the outbreak compared to other members in society. So then now we need to think about why this outbreak inequality has happened. And again, when we think about migrant worker health and how that's connected to the structural disparities in the nature of employment, we need to think of health solutions that factor into account these structural conditions of labor. So we already know, right? The urban infrastructure was one, the impossibilities of social distancing relating to COVID-19, for example. But we also have been talking about wage, housing, sanitation, and food. All of this coming again together when thinking about migrant worker health. Not to forget migrant domestic workers in this conversation. So what we are finding in terms of mental health and migrant domestic workers, because it's another form of precarious labor that remains immobile. So when I say immobile, I mean that while a migrant domestic worker takes a plane and comes to Singapore to work in terms of migration mobility, what remains immobile is the confines of the household, right? So she works, rests, stays within the household. She's also surveilled within the household, for example, when you have cameras and so on. And all of this amplifies migrant domestic workers' mental health or their meanings of mental health. So with the day off now, or the day off sort of limited, or not limited, but rather not all employers, again, some employers may not be, maybe sort of dealing with this day off issue very differently. We might actually see an amplification of migrant domestic worker mental health. Jaya will be talking a bit more about this later in terms of what home is seeing, but what is also again important to remember is that the meanings of mental health with regard to migrant domestic workers are tied to space, are tied to food insecurity. So within a household, there might be food abundance, but whether or not the domestic worker is able to access food resources, for example, is another area of concern. And what we are finding is these are deeply connected to how domestic workers speak about their meanings of mental health. So when talking about mental health, domestic workers often tie it to space, food insecurity, to the nature of their labor. And then finally, media representation and voice. I will talk a bit more about COVID-19 and mainstream press in terms of migrant worker voice. What we have found previously is that in terms of how mainstream media has discussed migrant worker voices, representation and voice has not been as amplified as it has been in the current COVID-19 crisis. In terms of migrant worker health, again, specifically migrant construction workers, that's where we are really seeing the outbreak inequality pan out. And again, coming back to the structural inequalities that they face. I'm not going to repeat this, but again, we need to be wary of how health is fundamentally tied to food, labor, mental health, and sanitary conditions. And ultimately also thinking about how we can sort of create communicative conditions that are more equitable and more equal. So communicative equalities in terms of representation in media discourses, for example. So what are the solutions, right? We're talking about solutioning midterm and long-term. And I think a key premise that we need to sort of talk about and think about at this point is how can we engage migrant worker voices in solutioning and centering migrant worker voices in design. So there are a few ways in which we can approach this. So we can look at structural competency, and this pretty much relates to more the healthcare atmosphere. So currently, in medical settings, for example, medical professionals might use cultural competency as a model, but is cultural competency enough? So when a migrant worker, for example, walks into a clinic, is the medical professional able to assess the migrant worker looking at his or her structural conditions in which he or she resides in? So recognition of social structures that influence health disparities when thinking about or talking to migrant workers during the treatment process or during the diagnosis process, thinking about how the migrant worker can come on board with biomedical professionals and to talk about delivering more equitable health solutions, and finally interventions that are tied to their structural conditions. And this is relating to the medical, again, to the healthcare setting. But then we must also think now about in their employment conditions, right? So how can we think about community-centered strategies that activate their voice? Fundamentally, migrant workers see, live, and experience these inequalities. So they are their own best solution providers. So they are the ones that can sort of make sense of the kinds of disparities that they face, whether it's in terms of food, employment, salaries, dormitory conditions, and so on. So how do we sort of engage their voices in a way that equalizes communicative resources? So first, thinking about health resources and health information. How can health information be delivered more quickly? One, if we have a situation like this, if there's an outbreak again, or if there's in a pandemic response, are health resources able to go or reach migrant workers effectively? So that's part of the solutioning, right? What sorts of health information resources and how fast can they get to migrant workers? The distribution of health resources, so the channel use that fits the target audience, simply put. Were there resources, for example, health resources, whether it's about COVID-19 and the current situation pertaining to COVID-19, or the evolving nature of COVID-19, so the updates in the scientific community that also need to reach groups like migrant workers. Support resources, so in modes of clarification, for example, if a migrant worker wants to clarify or ask questions about COVID-19, do we have support resources for migrant workers in that sense? Centering their voices in terms of the creation of health resources, but as well as centering their voices in terms of how are they making sense of health information during this period. Co-creation in centering these resources, so there's a biomedical model in terms of structuring health information resources to migrant workers, but how can they be part of the co-creative process in terms of this health information resources? Resident engagement and community partnerships. So if we have a multi-stakeholder model in designing what's going to happen next, are migrant worker voices going to be centered? Are there going to be advisory boards where migrant workers are part of that process? And this is really not about tokenism, but truly equalizing communicative resources with migrant workers in mind. Solutions that are anchored in migrant worker community voices. So for example, in Alex's presentation, he talked about employment conditions, he talked about salary, that is amplified. Migrant workers often talk about, these are some of the key issues that they talk about. So when we sort of anchor their voices, what are the kinds of solutions we can think about in terms of midterm and long term? And finally, feedback mechanisms. So this is going to be an iterative process. This is going to be, let's take the food example. So, there is conversation that the food has improved. Now, how do we move forward? So this requires a feedback mechanism in place where migrant construction workers can constantly go back and forth with feedback mechanisms, thinking about moving forward with these feedback mechanisms, whether it pertains to food, again, salaries, dormitories, and so on. So have we created opportunities, channels, communicative infrastructures where these feedback mechanisms are amplified and known to migrant workers? And then finally, thinking about mainstream press, migrant workers, and COVID-19. So what we find is that, in fact, in this moment of crisis, or while I'm discourse tracing the mainstream press and COVID-19 and how migrant workers were centered, we do find that the mainstream press has anchored competing voices. And they not only have anchored competing voices, but migrant worker voices were present and represented. I'm just giving an example here in one of very recent articles, how basically we see migrant workers being able to speak in these various media infrastructures. So does a crisis present an opportunity and point of transformation? Is that something that we are seeing in mainstream press, for example? And then finally, ending off with the Japa Forum letter, I think what needs to be, thinking about xenophobia and racism towards migrant domestic workers and construction workers, we need to really think about whether, so for example, with the Japa Forum letter and the issues that followed, is there really no space for those, when thinking about a letter like that that gets published, we need to think about whether there is space for the powerless to speak back. If there isn't space for the powerless to speak back, then what does this do? Does this circulate marginalizing discourses that would further create powerlessness within these types of groups without any real engagement, where there's really no opportunity for a migrant worker to craft a forum letter back about or speak back about what has been circulated about them. So I think that's something that we really need to think about as well when thinking about xenophobic issues pertaining to migrant workers. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Satveer. I think that was very clear what you have said, how important it is to look at migrant workers from a participatory approach, people who have voices, who can be part of their own discourse, and how we can work towards stopping the segregatory approaches that we have taken on. I think that was very useful. So thank you very much. Next speaker, please, Dr. Imran bin Tajudeen.
Hi, let me get this sorted with my screen. Sharing screen. Okay, here we go. I think this should be, is it showing? Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Let's begin. So, yeah, okay. Well, let me begin by talking about, maybe I should firstly qualify. I think when Braema introduced me, there was a little slip in the explanation. I'm not really doing a continuing research on dormitories. I'm looking at critical perspectives on the built environment, and that's where I situate my interest in dormitories. Because dormitories have interestingly emerged as a very, it's a remarkable blind spot in the general knowledge of most architects that I have managed to speak to. And I've been working with a group of architects, practicing architects. I'm not a practicing architect myself. I should qualify that from the upstart. And so what I'm looking at is instead from the position of a researcher and historian, actually. What I'm interested in looking at is actually how to situate the production of architecture within larger forces. And that's where I think I want to amplify what Alex was saying earlier. Of course, he emphasized a lot that from his perspective as a person who engages the workers and their concerns, their on-the-ground concerns, dormitories feature very low in their day-to-day priority. But I would like to argue, and not exactly countering Alex at all, that actually the built environment, our context of living, is absolutely fundamental. And if we were to just go by how the workers themselves articulate their concerns, we would neglect this very important basic provision. But let me start. So larger than just the issue of dormitories is the issue of demand, supply, and costs with regard to the workers as a whole. So Alex already talked about taxation via levies. There are other forms of costs that he has enumerated. But I think there's also the profit-making enterprises that are the investors and operators of the dormitories. I'm just laying out to you here something that's public knowledge since 2015. If you were to read the Business Times, this is the kind of profits made and the quick turnover within 1 or 2 years when our dormitories are full. Which means, are we looking at worker housing? Are we regarding our migrant workers as our workers? Are we saying, no, they're not citizens, right? And so we don't provide for them the same way we do for our workers. But we do provide for our workers public housing, whether it's built by HDB or JTC in the past, were for Singapore workers. So if we were to see the workers as imported poor, if you like, who are actually our workforce, then is worker housing a public good? And then on the other hand, you have others talking about the whole idea of demand and supply of the workers themselves. And this has to do with the standards of the construction industry, which is very labor intensive. This is if we were to listen to Leo Lam Keong talking on the recent webinar, he raised this point of improving the construction standards. Having talked about this quick background, I now want to move to the worker housing or accommodation. And again, it's really a matter of perspective. If we were to look at housing provision as a basic need and a right, maybe just talk about basic needs. We don't like to talk about basic rights, right? So basic need. If we talk about basic need, then we have to situate it within the needs of the migrant workers' rest. They need sufficient rest. Imagine 12 or 16 in some cases men to a room, trying to sleep when you come home at night. And so this is right now under private enterprise, as opposed to the longer history of our remarkable housing provision in Singapore. And you know, it's really correct to say that this is already improvement. This is an ongoing process of improvement of the dormitories. What we're looking at, if you were to read some articles from 2015, there has been very active checks on dormitories, and articles have appeared in which a dormitory provision that fell below standards, and we'll come to standards next, were fined under the new Foreign Employees Dormitories Act that was enacted in 2015. So we'll come to the question of what are these regulations next. But apparently that was the case. And if I just put Anil Lefebvre there because I think I just wanted to cite him a little bit. And that has to do with the fact that designers and draftsmen move within a space of paper and ink. I'm continuing from that quote there, the abstraction. So only after this nearly complete reduction of the everyday do they return to the scale of lived experience. I want to come back to this point about reduction and lived experience later. And I really want to again echo what Dr. Satveer just said earlier about involving the users, the migrant workers themselves, in any kind of revision to their conditions of living. And you know, right now we can talk about the immediate position of the role of technical experts, architects, and urbanists, but in the medium term, really, that has to be the larger issue of recalibrating who provides for accommodation and dorms, and you know, the neo-monopoly profit motive setups that are currently behind the provision of housing for them. And in the long term, I think we really need to recontextualize our dual housing system on top of, and I call it dual, you could well call it triple, quadruple, because there's still private housing. I discount private housing. If we only look at public housing provision, most of us, I consider myself also a worker. We're all workers of some sort or another, right? Just different degrees of labor, however we define that. But what I mean is the dual context of housing really should stop. I have this lengthy quote, but I think I'll skip that. It's too abstract. But just suffice to say that the architecture and technical disciplines has a limited but very necessary agency. We must situate it within larger social and economic structures, and more importantly, social political frames of mind. How do we justify the specific ways by which the very production of architecture and the city deploys resources and accrues surpluses in certain ways? And this is really a loop, you know, because not only do the workers themselves produce architecture in the city, the way their accommodation is produced is also part of the whole question of where and how resources and surpluses are deployed and accrued. As I just showed you earlier, the amount of profit making, it goes into their accommodation, which is very ironic. It's really interesting. So I want to talk again about the abstraction and I mean, this is, I'm plucking this image from IBS CBN News that cites this picture obtained from Reuters. So I don't know what that means, but this image shows by now one of the, I'm not going to name any dormitories except if it's labeled there. As some of you might recognize which dormitory room this is. And how do we come to that situation? How do we, these two are slightly different from each other. They're different dorms, by the way, but they have the same conditions, which is the room has a dead end. It is 8 meters deep by 6 meters wide. There is only one ceiling fan, which stands for the necessary provision of a fan for the ventilation. And so 12 men 12 men in a room like this, 8 meters deep, only one side. And the windows open up to a corridor, and there are these louvered fixed windows with a door in the center. So if you can imagine 6 meters with a door in the center and flanked by 2 windows. Now, so I'm very quickly going to go through this. Which are the codes, which are the codes that govern such buildings? There are a number actually, and if you speak to most practicing architects, some of them know some and some of them don't know some, and it's all over the place. So that's also something that, but beyond codes is also the finished product, which in itself, if you see, there's a variety. This is of course not the only type of dormitory. I need to qualify that these 2 examples come from one of at least 3 different kinds of what we call purpose-built dorms. If you recall the list earlier, there are only 43 purpose-built dorms, of which there is a variety of types. So I'm talking about the lowest, the worst type actually. And so this is the worst type. And yet these worst types, I think, just barely meet the codes except for one aspect. And I'm going to talk about that, how it barely meets the codes as it exists today. And that one aspect where it's a bit unsure, nobody is quite clear. Even the practicing architects themselves are not clear how to look at this issue. And so I proceed with this big caveat. The first is the now much touted FEDA, the Foreign Employees Dormitories Act. But the thing is, the FEDA does not give you codes. It does not provide you with any codes. What it does is it says it is for the purpose of licensing and for standards to be observed and for enforcement and continuous improvements. And it says you refer to BCA, Fire Safety Act, Planning Act, and other prescribed written acts for the dorms. And the interface with other laws makes this even clearer. Now, one of the mysteries that the group of architects I worked with and I unearthed is this thing called the technical regulations, the TR. Now, TR is interesting because it was endorsed on 14 October 2014. It's not a code, it's not mandatory to follow it, but instead you have it as a kind of provisional application for 2 years, after which it's supposed to be reviewed to determine its suitability as a Singapore standard. Comments and feedback, on another page it's mentioned, comments and feedback is welcome. Actually, it's here. You can submit using the feedback form provided at the end of the technical reference. It'll be taken into account for the review after 2 years. As far as we know, there hasn't been no review. Anyway, the following year, as you know, FEDA was enacted, but FEDA does not contain codes, does not specify, right? So you've got this very interesting situation. And moreover, when I asked TWC2 recently, they were not consulted for this. I'm surprised because that's the user group, as we would call it nowadays. They represent rather the user group because the workers themselves cannot form a committee to represent themselves in Singapore. But and neither was the Singapore Institute of Architects. So the architects were not consulted. I've highlighted a few relevant. The DASL is Dormitory Association of Singapore Limited. And then you have HDB, URA, BCA, and MOM, but not the Singapore Institute of Architects, nor the NGOs. It's quite interesting. And actually only this technical reference, which is not mandatory, which is not a code, it is only provisional. It is the only code to actually specifically use the word cross ventilation. If I'm just focusing on one because of our lack of time. Ventilation in the codes only this non-mandatory, non-code, just recommendations mention cross ventilation. And then it goes on to talk about other things, but it does not explicitly say what fulfills cross ventilation. If we go on to the SCDF fire code, it does not stipulate anything for bedrooms. It stipulates something for the internal corridors because it's about fireman access, for example. If you go on to the BCA or Building Control Act regulations, then you have mention of natural ventilation. So in this clause here, 3.2, you get natural ventilation being mentioned, 5% repeating what the TR mentioned earlier. Now it says specifically in the next clause, in one particular clause, that the openings must be to the exterior or else to an airwell or to a recess. It must be outside. right? But if you recall the earlier image here, these kinds of dormitories, they only have one side with windows and openings, and it's not to the outside, it's to the corridor. And that corridor is further blocked by, can you see these ledges with awnings to dry your clothes? That's for 12 men share this 6-meter long awning space along their corridor ledge. That's what you're looking at. If you're wondering what these planks, what these metal sheets, perforated metal sheets, and the rows of wire are about. So basically, it begins to raise a question which we don't know how to answer. We don't believe for even a second that any of these dormitories violate any codes, because they're all endorsed by the MOM, the Ministry of Manpower in Singapore. They are purpose-built dormitories regulated by the Ministry of Manpower. We do not for one second suspect that any of them violate any codes or any laws whatsoever. And so then the question comes, how come there's one category of dormitories that have windows only to a corridor? We can't answer. There's no other window anywhere else. It's a dead end. At least it's only 8 meters deep, so it fulfills the 12 meters as limit of distance from the nearest window or ventilation. But just imagine a room like that for 12 men. There was a recent report which gave the testimony from a worker who said that actually, you know, when you're in these rooms, I'm showing a variety. So when you're in the room on the top right there, an example there, it's very stuffy. So on certain nights, or on most nights, you can't sleep. As you know, Singapore is humid. If you have 12 men in a room, 8 meters deep, with one ceiling fan, it can get quite stuffy. So you've got that. But you see the other rooms, other types of dormitories, they are better. And of course, the one at the bottom right is not even a dormitory, it's an SAF barrack room. So some of us were also asking this question. Why is it that we have a double standard? We have very good standards for cross ventilation. The windows you see at the back of this barrack room, where the workers in what we call essential services were shifted to on 9th April, if I recall. The windows you see at the far end is but one of 2 sides with windows. So where they are facing, where our back is, there are further windows and the door to the corridor. So this is very well ventilated, and it's only for six persons. It's so much bigger than the. I mean, it's so much more provision in terms of the standards, living space standards. Maybe I'm getting too technical, but living space standards refers to the square meters allocated per occupant. You go on to Dormitories Act. So for my presentation, I'll focus on the codes rather than the midterm and the long term, which we can maybe discuss later. But still going on to the codes, if you look at the URA, sorry, this is still the FEDA. So the FEDA, as I mentioned earlier, the interface with other laws. So it doesn't actually give you anything. There is a variety of different codes in different places, which all tell you different things. Ventilation as well is mentioned, but the only thing is that in the building, this is the building control regulation. There is mention of ventilation, but there is no kind of mention specifically of cross ventilation, which is, I think, crucial. And then you have other, now, a lot of times you hear in defense of the dormitories, the fact that they provide much more than living space standards. Okay, minimum 4.5. This is from the URA. So they provide much more under the FEDA, as well as by what URA says, as well as from the TR. So sometimes it's a bit uncertain, like it says strongly encouraged rather than compulsory. Sick days strongly encouraged, but sick days are made kind of stipulated by the TR, which is subsumed under the FEDA. But as I mentioned, the TR is not mandatory. It's not the Singapore code, Singapore standards. So you've got all of these question marks going around. URA says it's strongly encouraged to have a sick day.
Imran,
strongly encouraged to have a washing. And
to concluding.
Okay, actually, this is the end. This is the end. So I would like to end at these two. So what happens here is that if you go back to how TWC2 once recommended satellite towns, actually, sometime back, satellite towns were recommended 2015? Yes. Round about actually the time of the review and the enactment of FEDA, they actually mentioned, you know, maybe you could even have proper satellite towns rather than dormitories. But what has led to this situation, of course, is this also longer term issue, which is the separation of the workers from the rest of society in Singapore. So to keep them within their dormitory, these purpose-built dormitories. Let's not talk about the private accommodation in Geylang, in Jalan Besar, in Serangoon Road. There are plenty, and there they don't live in purpose-built dormitories, which is another question. So is that more desirable in the sense that they are integrated? So if they are regulated in private accommodation in the city, for example, or in private apartments, is that better? This is a conversation we need to have, right? If we say purpose-built dormitories that are consigned to the peripheries, if you look at the planning, the regulations under URA, they cannot be in the central area, they cannot be in certain areas, but business parks, they cannot be in, and so on. So if you look at the distribution, they're mostly in peripheral or industrial areas, actually. So which is the alternative then in the medium term, actually? Where are they supposed to be situated? That's something that would be interesting to also discuss. If not purpose-built dorms, then where? You mean private accommodation? You mean just where? Where would they be, and what would be the ideal situation? Complete integration, satellite towns, as TWC2 recommended in 2015. These are some of the things that I wanted to bring up as somebody who looks at the built environment. Thank you very much, everybody here.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Imran. I have learned a lot about TR, technical reference, and 2014, FIDA was enacted 2015, and I kept hearing the word not mandatory, ventilation, core element, lighting. I think there's a lot that you have raised in the details that you have brought, going to a fundamental right issue about living space, your dwelling, your residential. So what then will be the later part of in re-looking and reviewing how we are going to improve matters, what is the living space for migrant workers, and what is the integration norm with Singaporeans. It cannot be a segregationist approach that we have taken on board. So I think these are all the questions that have come up, and harmonizing across all the different bodies that are looking into architectural designs and approval schemes and everything. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jaya. Jaya, it's your Ms. Jaya Aru.
Yes, I am here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I don't have a prepared presentation, but what I'm going to sort of do is to sort of bring the discussion over to the migrant domestic workers, because these are a group of people that haven't really been talked about much over the course of the last month. But we have to be aware that they too face a lot of issues, especially since the onset of the circuit breaker period. They are living in their employers' houses, and that actually gives rise to a lot of problems, well-being and exploitation issues that they are facing. So I think a good starting point would be to say that migrant domestic workers, they are not included under the primary labor legislation in Singapore, which is the Employment Act. And what this means is that they don't have fixed working hours. They don't have the concept of overtime pay. And I think in the previous presentations, we've been talking a lot about salary and all of that. So for them, for however much work that they do in their employers' houses, their pay is the same on a monthly basis. Now, why is that relevant now? The issue is that many families during the circuit breaker period are staying at home, and all family members are staying at home. This invariably translates to an increase in the working hours, increase in the workload, increase in household and caregiving duties. And I'm going to link this back to the kind of issues that we've been hearing from domestic workers. So we have a helpline, and we have seen about a 20% increase in the number of calls to the helpline. And one of the issues that has been articulated by domestic workers currently during the circuit breaker period is that their workload has increased. They're sleeping at 1 or 2 a.m. Because, you know, they just have a lot more work to do. And like I said before, we have to bear in mind that this is all for the same pay. Related to that now is also the fact that, you know, when you stay with your employers 24/7, there are invariably bound to be issues of disputes, tensions that arise between employers and the domestic workers. So we've also seen an increase in domestic workers saying that they are facing verbal abuse, you know, employers are scolding them. What is the effect of this? This will, I will elaborate more on this later, but this has a very negative impact on their mental health. I think in the previous presentations and generally in our discourse of migrant workers, we have said that the migrant workers who are living in the dormitories, they're facing a lot of mental health issues because they're anxious. You know, they're inside the dormitories where the virus is rampant, it's widespread. Similar, I mean, anxiety and stress is also currently very prevalent for the migrant domestic workers, you know, because they are just, a lot of them feel constantly stressed and overworked. And also, you know, when they have to face scolding by their employers, it's not a very easy situation for them. The next point that I want to make also is domestic workers are, they have been recognized as a vulnerable group by our laws. So the penal code has been amended to reflect that if you abuse a domestic worker, your punishment can go up to 2 times what is stipulated. So now when they face increased isolation, so we are in a circuit breaker period where domestic workers have to be inside all the time. They are subject to the same circuit breaker regulations as everyone else. You can't go out unless it's for essential needs to buy food and all of that. And domestic workers normally, even before the circuit breaker period, they are subject to surveillance. Some of them are subject to surveillance and have phone restrictions imposed on them by their employers. So now what does this mean in this time? We have heard that there have been reports of domestic violence increasing and all of that. So domestic workers who are in a precarious situation, who are facing extreme exploitative conditions or even abusive conditions, it is that much harder for them to reach out for help. Their employers are at home, the abuser is there all the time. They don't have access to their phones, which is a very important tool for them at this point to sort of access the outside world, given their increased isolation, in order to tell someone, you know, that they need help, that they need assistance. Our helpline has seen some calls from both concerned members of the public as well as friends of domestic workers saying, I think something not quite right is going on in the house next to me. I hear a lot of shouting from the employer to their domestic worker. So what home does is to give the appropriate advice. You know, if it's a situation where the police has to be brought in, we advise accordingly. Still on the point of isolation, I think we have alluded also to the issue of double standards being imposed on, you know, migrant workers on the one hand and the broader population on the other. You know, domestic workers, they are subject to the same circuit breaker regulations, but we have had accounts of employers who have told their domestic workers, no, you're not allowed to go out, even to run your essential errands. And domestic workers, they need to remit money. Sometimes, you know, they don't have enough food at home, and these are issues and things that they have faced even before, you know, the onset of COVID-19. But it's just been exacerbated now because of the circuit breaker regulations. So we've had calls for help where a domestic worker has said, I need to leave the house, I need to send money, but I can't because my employer is just not allowing me to do so. So what we do is that we advise domestic workers, these are your rights under the laws. You are allowed to leave the house for essential errands and all of that. And we offer to speak to their employers to sort of mediate the situation. So currently, a lot of the work that we do does involve mediation as between employers and domestic workers because of what I will elaborate on in a short while. Domestic workers who feel the need to leave their employers' houses, or domestic workers who have been perhaps terminated by their employers. Currently, there is a problem of not having sufficient space for them to go. The reason for that is that dedicated shelters for domestic workers, we are facing a space crunch because we have to implement effective safe distancing measures and to cap the number of occupants in such shelters at a safe number. So we have been talking about, accommodation and all for the migrant, the non-domestic workers, but this is something that migrant domestic workers are facing. Some of them simply don't have a choice. They've been asked to pack their bags and to leave their employers' houses. Normally, they could go to their agencies' lodging facilities, which are also full at the moment. So, some of them are in a really, precarious position because they are faced with the situation of having almost nowhere to go. That is the main, and the last point that I will touch on is salary problems vis-a-vis domestic workers. Now, we talk about employers and non-domestic workers and, salaries not being paid at this time, which is a big issue. But domestic workers are facing similar things. We have had domestic workers who have told us, well, my employer has asked me to take a salary cut because she can't afford to pay me at this time because her business is doing badly. She has just lost her job. What am I supposed to do? Some have even been asked to go on no pay leave. They don't know whether they will be subsequently compensated, once the whole COVID situation is over. Rest day compensation. Now, this is quite a key issue for domestic workers, even before the circuit breaker and even before COVID, which has gotten a lot bigger. Rest day compensation, right now, the law stipulates that a domestic worker is entitled to one rest day a week, sorry. And if she does work during this one rest day, she has to be compensated. Now, the problem with domestic workers staying in their employers' houses all the time, and especially for domestic workers who don't really have a space of their own in their employers' houses. What this happens then is that on their supposed rest day, they just end up doing work. MOM has issued many advisories and statements saying that all work done during rest days needs to be compensated because now domestic workers are staying at home. But we have seen even before COVID where domestic workers, they will do a few hours of work in the morning, go out for their rest day, come back and, continue to do some work. And they're not necessarily paid for this work. And the reason is that maybe there is some ambiguity as to what is a rest day. Does it constitute something? Is it 24 hours? And it's not defined. So because of this ambiguity, some pockets of work done may go uncompensated. And it's also got to do a lot with the perception of domestic work generally, because people deem domestic work to be something that's informal. So, the idea could be that, oh, but I just asked her to do, a few hours of this. Do I really have to pay her? It's that sort of a perception as well that is sort of, that sort of gives rise to this kinds of issues. So we do need some clarity on that. I will just make one point that links back to my first point of rest. Because when we're talking about rest day, I did mention that that domestic workers are not covered under the Employment Act, but they are covered under a secondary piece of legislation, which is the Employment of Foreign Manpower Act. Now, this act does set out some well-being standards for domestic workers. And when it comes to rest, the standard that is articulated is domestic workers need to get adequate rest. However, what is adequate? It is not defined. So, you know, is 14 hours of work, you know, and then you get to sleep after that. Is that adequate rest? If you have a 16-hour day with pockets of rest in between, is that adequate rest? So there is a lot of ambiguity and in terms of these well-being standards, and that really is the crux of the issues when it comes to domestic workers. It's because a lot of their work is seen as informal. It's not, their rights are not crystallized, which gives rise to a lot of well-being issues, a lot of room for exploitation, which we have seen happening, especially during this circuit breaker period. And that's for domestic workers. I will now speak on behalf of my colleagues who have been working very closely with the non-domestic workers. Two of my colleagues, we have been doing outreach, and Home has been doing outreach with the non-domestic workers who are not living in the dorms. So as Imran has said, as Alex has said, there are many of them who are renting bed space in the open market. And there are more than we think, you know. In fact, the purpose-built dorms actually do not account for the majority of the work permit holders who are in Singapore. And I'd just like to highlight, and this has already been articulated in the previous presentation, so I'll just gloss over this very quickly. Because there are systemic modes now in these purpose-built dorms and in the factory converted dorms by MOM and FAST teams to sort of deploy food and supplies and all of that. But those who living in very informal spaces tend to get left out. So what happens? So, you know, and Home has been has been giving them food, giving them medical supplies. A big sort of concern that they are raising is, and I'm just echoing what Imran and Alex have said, is that of salary. They are unsure about their salary, whether they're going to be paid. Yes, the M1 directives have said that they are to be paid during this time, but you know, I think there are questions of enforcement as well. They don't know whether after the dust has settled, are they going to, do they have jobs? You know, they are very, very financially insecure, which brings me sort of to the sort of a few recommendations, which I guess we can elaborate on in the discussion. This has been mentioned by Alex as well, but for both domestic workers and for the non-domestic workers, we need to improve their financial security. By improving their financial security, it gives them the power to reject some of these conditions that, you know, which are just untenable. The problem as to why they say okay to certain, you know, to dorm conditions, to less than ideal working conditions, is because they do not want to lose their jobs. They do need the money. And when I mean financial security, you know, I am referring to things like changing, you know, they have very, very crippling recruitment debts, both domestic and non-domestic workers. How are we going to change that? Is minimum wage also a viable solution? And just my last point, because I am aware that I'm short of time, is let's start addressing the mental health of our migrant workers. You know, now we are seeing helplines and you know, WhatsApp numbers being spread around for people to call, for the migrant workers in the dorms to call, to reach out if they are feeling anxious and all of that. But why not make this readily available even after COVID? You know, they do stressful jobs and they have a lot of stresses. Their living conditions also make things stressful for them. So their mental health is also something I think we need to talk about and have resources available for them to access very easily, you know, if they're feeling stressed, if they're feeling anxious. So yes, that's it for me. And yes, back to you, Braema.
Thank you very much, Jaya. I think you have painted quite clearly what kind of distress signals are coming. And with physical distancing, it is harder to really know how you are, how to offer help more quickly and more suitably to the persons, as well as I think you have also touched about the non-representation under the Employment Act, although there's another law for foreign domestic workers, where the stipulation of contractual terms can go into contracts that may not even be consistent on certain core things about work days and hours and the kind of tasks that they have to do, and how right now under the CB, maybe we do not really know how the domestic workers really are working in the home. Then thank you for sharing about the work done in terms of food supplies, etc., with the core elements still there, salaries, etc., and suggestions. Thank you very much. I would like to appeal, thank you. Thank you everyone, all speakers would like you to come back with your video on, please, so that we can go into part 2 of this forum, which is a discussion. So Alex, Satveer, and Imran, could you please come back with your onto the visual screen? Thank you. So I would like to, there are questions coming, and some of them are also part of what we are going to discuss. So based on all that has been talked about, I think there are core elements coming out as what is the now that we need, that you as folks on the ground, as people observing the scene, you hope will happen for however long that we think the CB can last. Some of it you have already said in your presentations, maybe some further itemizing of what cannot be compromised. Then we will move to midterm as the CB is taken off and goes into phases, what it ought to be, and long term. I think if we could have that discussion for the next about 15 minutes, I would appreciate that. Anyone would like to start off, please? Alex, are you there? You got to unmute your, you got to, hello? Are you all in there?
I'm here, Braema.
Okay, whoever would like to start, please. Just some of it has already come in the presentations and some I think need more elaboration. Would you like to start, Imran?
No, I think it would be good to hear the NGOs first, I think.
Okay.
Yeah,
Alex,
respect to them, yeah.
Alex or Jaya? Are you all there?
Yeah,
Jaya?
I'm sorry. I just what is the question? You said
What is
too much. I forgot what the
the question is, we have all talked quite a lot and we have heard each other. I would think it's a good time to itemize what you think right now ought to happen in the situation of the circuit breaker, what ought to happen midterm as we phase out from the circuit breaker, and long term, so that this just doesn't become an episode. Yeah, and I think the Minister of Manpower has made promises. Minister for National Development, Lawrence Wong, has made promises, as well as the Prime Minister. So from the NGO perspective and others amongst us who are observers, can we just have a tighter discussion on the now, the midterm, and the long term? Could you please start, Alex?
Okay. Well, what's been hopeful, of course, is the Manpower Minister's assurance that dormitory standards will be looked into going forward, and obviously that is the immediate thing that must be done as soon as we get some breathing space from the crisis right now. I have a sense, however, that the infection rates may reach plateau levels quite soon. It's unfortunate the plateau is so high, but just looking forward, I think we should first fix the dorms. But I'm really concerned, and I think my colleagues at TWC2 are also very concerned, that after fixing the dorms, we'll just all relax and forget about everything else. As I said, they're just a symptom of a much greater structural problem, as Satveer, well put it. And we really have to move on, because you see, this is not going to be the only kind of problems we're going to face, infections. There'll be other problems. So we might as well take the opportunity now before it's too late to address issues of financial security, of recruitment, misrepresentation, deception, and all sorts of abuses, and put our country, Singapore, we're not just talking about migrant workers, the whole country has to be put on a different economic model that gives us a more secure foundation going into the future. We should be a first world country, yes, but not a first world country in the same way as the Gulf states, which rely on cheap labor, but a first world country by the same standards as other first world countries like, Japan, Europe, and North America.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else for the now? Just about 2 more minutes for the now. Anyone else wants to jump in? Alex has said it cannot go back. I think all of us agree it cannot go back. The pandemic must become a lesson for all of us to improve upon. Assurances given by cabinet ministers, ministers in the cabinet. So anything else for the now? What do you think, Jaya, in terms of the distress calls, in terms of, for example, support staff, and under this physical distancing that goes on, how are we going to help anyone stuck in the home from domestic violence, etc., or violence to an employee?
Yeah, I think,
yes, please.
Yeah, I think, there has been a lot of community work being done also, to try and find shelter space for domestic workers who are in distress and all of that. Maybe that needs to be consolidated a bit, because right now it's very informal, and it's, this person is calling that person to sort of see what can be done and all of that. And of course, the NGOs are trying their best also to see what is the help that can be rendered, and doing a lot of the negotiations and a lot of the coordination. But I think we have to just acknowledge that these are novel times, and but we have to be aware that these are needs faced by the community. So if there is a group of them that has that are facing abusive or exploitative conditions, and they have to go somewhere, then there has to be, I guess, more dedicated spaces for them to be able to go to.
Yeah, thank you. Jaya, I hope you have switched on your video so that you can come on screen when you speak.
Yes, I am.
Then, maybe we need some technical advice there. Okay, coming back to what you have said, both maybe just a quick one on the now, and that goes into midterm, both Alex as well as Jaya, that I think the NGOs in such an emergency, one is very strapped for human resources. There are plentiful volunteers. I think many Singaporeans have woken up to wanting to help and doing as much as they can, but trained personnel, are the NGOs well supported in this area, and how is the funding structure? It cannot, I mean, it's 1.1 million migrant workers out of a population of 5.7. So it is quite a substantive number. How are the NGOs supported? And for a now situation, is it good enough? Do you have anything that you would like to say in this case? Alex or Jaya, or both?
May I?
Yes.
Yeah, it's good that you raised this point, because, and Jaya too, that there are lots of people, lots of workers, for example, living outside the dormitories. So another problem about this conversation that is in a public space, not so much in our webinar now, that is so dominated by talk about dormitories, is that we are forgetting about workers who are actually staying in rented accommodation, right? And the big problem now is that they are being forgotten, and we are getting enormous requests, calls by these workers for assistance with rent, because they have no work now. They're not allowed to work. The whole country is in a lockdown, but the landlords are demanding rent. I think those landlords are not about to give them the rent rebates that the finance minister gave out, and I'm not sure how they can claim that. So we really need to think about what sort of social safety net we have when workers have to pay rent on their own, and yet, they can't go out and earn money. Now, this special group of workers contain a lot of special pass holders, another overlooked group. These are workers who have filed claims against their employers. That means they are already in dispute with their employers. Either it's a salary claim because they've not been paid for 6 months, or it's an injury claim because they're injured at work. The usual mantra in Singapore is the employer is responsible for looking after you. But come on, it's very much like a domestic worker situation. You're already in conflict with your employer. How can the state then say, oh, it's not the state's business. The employer is supposed to look after you. I mean, that is the kind of regulatory system that is completely divorced from reality. And so the one area where we need help now is to help these guys out there who really need rent money, because before you know, they're going to be sleeping on the streets. And then we have another problem.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. I'm glad you have highlighted the non-dorm space in case it becomes another cluster and varied, because everyone is staying in different places, and also the funding situation for them, the finances, if they are not being paid as passes, weaker and all that, how are they surviving? So there's a call out there that is being made for the now by the NGOs right now that we have who are in this forum, and I think that's a very good point that you have shared. And I think perhaps more help with the home-based situation. Am I right, Jaya?
Yes, I just wanted to absolutely agree with Alex. I think that we just have to be aware that we need equitable distribution. So
equitable distribution,
which means that let's not ignore the people who are renting the bed space in the open market. They do need financial assistance, is a very real need for them. This is something Home is helping them with as well, which a lot of our fundraising efforts now, it's intended to actually help these workers who need money to survive, the now, and to be able to live on a day-to-day basis. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Satveer, this is also coming from some of the questions, and I'm clustering them as well as to expand this discussion. For the now to midterm to even long term, how are we going to engage? You raised it, the whole thing about participatory interconnectivities with the very people whom we are talking about. How do you see that can be done? And how do we bring a greater correlation between citizens and migrant workers? Any ideas that you have? Even Imran, in the whole designing of the structural approach to living spaces. Anything both of you would like to share? Open, of course, to Alex and Jaya too. Could you all please? And let's make it a little bit shorter and sharper, because I see the questions coming in and I want to give at least 15 minutes to question time. Could you please? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So also another aspect in the short term is we need to think also about reducing health information disparities. So as COVID evolves, as the COVID-19 situation evolves, we also, not to put this on the NGOs, because I think the NGOs are completely overstretched, but also thinking about whether are there creative ways in which maybe from the academic community, where we really need to start thinking about how can we bridge that information disparity. So the evolving scientific information and evidence that's coming up, how do we get this to migrant domestic workers and migrant construction workers effectively in the short term? I think that is also quite critical. And also that helps to alleviate fears that amplifies mental health issues with the migrant worker community.
Thank you. So greater, more academics coming in to help out in information passageways, etc., and in crafting information. Mental health is a huge issue, right? Even Singaporeans in the lockdown coping with mental health issue. Anybody in the whole wide world is coping with mental health issue in a lockdown. So what more a person who's a migrant worker with little contact with the home and all. So for the now, we need more people who know. We can't have everybody and anybody into mental health. Am I right? It has to be people who do know, and we are stretched, as you said. Imran, are there any thoughts from you?
we're still talking about the immediate, right? Not yet the midterm.
And midterm, immediate.
And midterm. Okay, good. Then, because right now, as we speak, you know, the workers, many of the workers are being decanted, moved to alternative or temporary accommodation. Red Hill Close being one of them, and several others. And at the same time, new and improved or amended codes, or not yet codes, but new regulations are in place, you know, new parameters are in place. So what happens now is that the existing dorms need to immediately be retrofitted for those that fall below these new amended, thank goodness they are amended, these new regulations. And more importantly, in the midterm, in the immediate term, of course, these new amendments need to be fed back into codes. So they become mandatory, and that these codes be enlarged to regulate not just those larger than having 1,000 residents, which are the PBDs, purpose-built, but those below it. In other words, it should be all-encompassing to regulate all worker housing accommodation, because we should see this as a vulnerable and very important workforce group. We should. Right now, you know, it's not. There's no real. Anyway, and it's kind of a. I mean, if I can say this also, I could even suggest something like, you know, schools, universities, polytechnics, students who are looking at architecture, you know, whether they, but more importantly, workers' input in the midterm, because not all the workers are so transient. And because some of them have worked for 6 years, 11 years here in Singapore. You know, they've worked so long. They're practically part of our, no, not practically, they are part of our landscape, really. Practically, whatever, you know. But the point is that they work in, many of them work in the construction industry. They would know how to draw, they know technical specs, they know everything. So why are we not talking to them? It's really, really odd. So this was one of the things when I approached TWC with my group of friends. I was saying, you know, whether, you know, in the midterm, we could think about how TWC can be engaged together with the workers to feed, because right now, as far as I know, the architects who are working on this, they're not thinking of, or they don't have it within their framework. Maybe they think about it, but it's not within their framework to include the voice of the users, or even some of the ideas from the NGOs in the past. Of course, all of this has to be discussed. It's not like you know, adopted wholesale, but the point is that the discussion has to encompass more than just the technical experts. Yeah, I think that's the midterm.
Yep, thank you very much, Imran. I think you have mentioned 2 or 3 key points that I think I just want to recap. Retrofitting has to take place before the persons can go back to any of the dorms that they have been evacuated from. And therefore, how is that going to be done? What is the response from those people, the migrant workers themselves who have lived there, and how can that be accommodated to your midterm? I think is excellent. Polytechnics and all that, they can come together. And I think from what Alex and Jaya have shared, how do we make, and Satveer, how do we make the migrant worker a key component in those discussions and work groups? This part that I have just summarized from what you all have said, and pardon me if I've not done a thorough summary, also comes from quite a number of the questions that are coming in the chat postings. Many are asking, how do we make sure they become a regular workforce in these kind of work groups or chat groups, there, whereby their points of view, etc., are incorporated into the restructuring of what we may call living spaces, which also means then, this is not in the question, but I would like to hear fast responses, if you do not mind. Where do you think the Singaporean is? How is it? Where is the Singaporean? There are many wonderful efforts going on by Singaporeans right now and those who live in Singapore. And I had no time to put all the things in one slide to give where can people donate. I will get onto it over the weekend. But coming to this, right? Coming to this, where do you think the Singaporeans are in terms of where they want the migrant worker to be? I think this is core, it's a core value system. Prime Minister has appreciated them, but how far on the spectrum is appreciation to making them part of ourselves, our society? Any views, please? Alex, would you like to start? Or Satveer?
Okay, you know, TWC too, we're always a little skeptical about appreciation. So let's be very honest about it. Very often it's used as a kind of like a device to avoid the harder question of what place we see our migrant workers should have. Okay, we appreciate what we are doing, but then, you know, it's like giving a gift and that's the end of your engagement. So we have a problem with that. Let me give you a specific example, okay? And I think Imran would love this, because on the question of food, what are we doing now, all right? We are running around trying to organize catered food to the dormitories, even right now, okay? But when we ask the workers, what would they like in terms of food provision going forward, in the way the dorms are designed, they say, we want our own little kitchen. All right, they don't want catered food. You can try your best. You can have 100,000 bureaucrats trying to organize catered food. But actually, if you spoke to the workers, they say, I have plenty of time in a lockdown. I wish I could just cook my own food. If only I had a little kitchen in my dorm room. So when we go forward in drawing up new and improved codes for the architects, for example, if only you heard the workers, just a simple question, what would you like? They want a little kitchen so they can cook their own. And frankly, in the next pandemic, when we have a next lockdown, we don't then have to run around and look for catered food anymore. We just deliver the vegetables, the raw vegetables and whatever to them, and they cook their own in their own little room. After all, they got all the time in the world now. So you see how important it is to actually get the real voice from the worker. It changes the whole parameters of what we think we're going to design for.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in here because
please,
Alex
just make it interactive. Jump in. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in because I would like to, immediately follow on with what Alex said, and I completely agree, which is why one of the good, as I mentioned, there is a whole spectrum of dormitories. So there's one category which are somewhat like apartments, meaning that unlike having rows of rooms that amount to 12 per room, and you multiply it so that you get 240 per level, and the 240 share one common toilet and have to go downstairs to cook. That's the lowest type. You have the ones that have 16-bed apartments. They all share one kitchen, 3 toilets, and same number of shower cubicles. There are those that have 12 beds in an apartment, and they are split into 4 in 3 different rooms. I won't name names, they're all there. And then there are some that are 10 beds to an apartment. So what I mean by apartment, these are the better dorms. But what I mean by apartments is that each of these, when I say 16 bed, 10 bed, or 12 bed, these number of beds, these number of occupants have their own ensuite kitchen, their own ensuite set of 3 shower cubicles, and their own ensuite set of 3 toilets. I see this as one possible way forward. Maybe even improving it slightly further for ventilation. Some of them, the ventilation is okay, some not so okay, but at least the numbers are lower. And you can see the results, because in terms of the spread, it's not as high as the one that's highest. I'm not going to name names, but you know which one is the highest? That one is the lowest standard I was talking about. The other one that also came on early as an isolation area does not have the same numbers, nowhere near. And it's because they are the better apartment types. So I completely want to second what Alex is saying. It is so much better in terms of mental health, in terms of provision of what they can do for themselves, in terms of ratio of people to a toilet, and so on. It's just so much, and not only that, the construction materials used doesn't look like they're just temporary buildings that are made permanent, like
Yeah. Thank you very much, Imran and Alex, for that. If anything, Satveer and Jaya, just jump in. I just want to anchor this point that you all have made, and also on some that I've seen on social media, that communities know how to work out their kitchen if we give them the proportionate number by spaces to ratio of persons. I think I've seen this. They would love to do communal cooking and also make it as part of carrying on with their cultural habit. I think all this will come in under retrofitting to midterm to long term, and how do we get on their views and do, as you say, Imran, the structuring and the coding and revise some of the coding. The next part of this discussion has not been answered, and I'm coming back to that, which is the Singaporean. We have seen some really wonderful things Singaporeans are doing, and sorry, rather people in Singapore and Singaporeans, but we have also seen some really uncalled for nasty remarks, which I'm glad the Minister for Home Affairs and Minister for Law, Mr. Shanmugam, has put it in perspective. We do not know majority minority here, but what are the things that need to be done to help Singaporeans see the migrant worker as part of our community? Any views, please? Satveer or anybody? Yes, please.
Starts with, even in a forum like the one that we have organized here, is we don't see migrant worker representation, right? We don't see migrant worker voice. Ultimately, when talking about long-term solutions, the solutions that remain top-down, expert-driven, NGO-driven, and of only those voices are centered, they're going to be really removed from the experiences of workers. So if you're really talking about equalizing platforms, if you're really talking about equalizing communicative solutions, right, then fundamentally migrant workers need to be not just represented, they need to be able to speak back. And I think as a Singaporean, I hope that we have migrant workers that are very much part of our civil society, that are very much part of also being able to speak back and speak up for themselves. So I hope that sort of positions my standpoint on what I hope to see regarding migrant workers in Singapore and where they sort of, yeah.
Yep, I apologize for the non-represent. I'm not getting defensive because I really wanted to, because we got to apply for permit by Singapore laws, and I wanted to collate the voices of migrant workers to read out what they have said, at least 3 or 4 paragraphs. I apologize, there was really no more time, but you are correct. It cannot be just a representative. It has to be part of the core. And I think you have raised that whole thing that comes under communicative strategies. Till today, the national paper keeps calling foreign domestic workers as mates. Mates is so old school, and we need to change it into domestic worker, which is important. Worker has rights. ILO has been asking Singapore to ratify the convention that gives freedom of assembly, which I think our migrant workers do not have. And if they register themselves, it has to be under the embassy. I think that has not changed. So yes, if we recognize workers on a May Day, Labor Day, I think it is also equally important that we do not divide and segregate the workforce, and which comes to my point about education system, which I was hoping someone would say. If we are trying to build up a community, what more should our education system, starting from early childhood all the way into the whole what we call it mainstreaming, the whole national programs of school, what more do you all think can be done? Anyone? Anyone? On migrant workers?
Perhaps
Thank you. Yes.
maybe this is not so much about education, but right now we are seeing quite a lot of direct aid, which is great. There are people who are really giving a lot and people who are volunteering. But we should also, we should separate band-aid solutions from systemic problems. And I think what everyone should start to really think about is what has led to these sort of to this situation right now. Because your earlier question was about where does the Singaporean stand vis-a-vis migrant workers? And I think a lot of people want to do a lot right now, which is great and which definitely needs to be done. But beyond that, we need to keep talking about migrant workers. We need to bring them as part of our society, our conversations. Stop speaking of them as peripheries of our society. And when we have sort of brought them into our space and accept that they are amongst us, you know, then I think it's a chance for things to get much better, because this is something that the population, the populace they care about it. And when people care about something, then change will happen, you know. Yeah.
I agree with you totally. Thank you, Jaya. But for paradigm shift to see migrant workers as part of our community, it's my view that our education system needs to really take this full on board and make them part of our fabric of our society and all the rest of it. There are excerpts of activities happening here and there, but it needs to become core. It cannot be like your helper brings you to the nursery school and she remains as not part of the person in your workforce. So I think there are things here that are more midterm to long term that we really need to review, other than wait for a pandemic to bring us together and feel a lot of compassion and empathy. It has to go back that they are workers and that they have rights. Okay, the last part of I'm summarizing. Sorry, Alex, come in. Alex, come in. Yep.
Yeah, I just want to interject here, because yes, when you have when you're talking about how to integrate them into our community, how to make them part of us, etc., etc. Here again, we are facing a structural problem.
Yep.
You know what the structural problem is? Circular migration. We have a policy where workers come in for 2-year contracts and then leave, and then another guy comes in or another woman comes in for another 2 years and then leave. They don't stay long enough, you see, and we paid a terrible price for this, because again, what happens is that when a worker starts to acquire skills and expects better income to compensate, he becomes too expensive for our cheap labor model. And so off you go home, get a new inexperienced worker. The construction worker who has worked 9 years, 11 years with us, yes, they exist, but they really are the rare breed. The vast majority of them come in, come out, come in, come out like a revolving door. It's really very hard to form a community when Singapore is nothing more than a hotel.
Yep. Thank you very much, Alex. I think that's very important, the structural approach, as well as I'm coming to the last part on the structural approach for long term, that you made it very clear about the levy, and in the estimate cost that you put in, it became almost 47% of taxing some of a lower base community of workers. The levy, as we have been told before, I do not know what proportion of it goes into the consolidated funds and how much of it comes back to the workers, and the employers too are squeezed. So one of the limitations that we have in this whole forum is the voice of the employer. And there's no more time for the employer, but some kind person sent me a recording from the radio of an employer saying how this employer, who's the middle person working between the employers as well as the migrant workers, has structured a unit that has got everything for the worker, the kitchen, the lavatory and sanitation is all good. But what did not come out is the cost that the worker has to pay even for a stylized, a better form of dwelling unit, which all goes back into the earlier discussion. So the whole structural reform long-term, I would love to hear from the NGOs as well as Satveer and Alex, Jaya, Satveer and Imran, that I think some of the long terms that are coming, I'm just trying to summarize too, is that some amendments to the law, making them part of core community in Singapore, revising how we structure our living spaces. But I think this part, what would you like to see what do you hope to see in terms of the structuring of how we bring in migrant workers and the whole schematic approach that Alex really dived in very clearly right at the beginning of this forum. Any strong anchor points to touch down on that, or even if it's a repeat, please just go ahead. Anyone?
Well, since there's space, so maybe I'll just quickly start.
Yes, please.
I think I put this under medium-term reconsiderations, but I think it's actually long-term.
Okay.
Really, are we able to arrive at a consensus that what the roles of the state are in regard to, you know, workers, the workforce that we rely on so greatly for so many important constructions? You know, again, coming from the critical perspective of the built environment, how it's produced, labor is fundamental, and it's often glossed over in any discussion of architectural history or whatever. So I mean, look, all these places that we're so proud of, these constructions, these structures, who built them? So, you know, how do we square this up with the fact that we say we don't want to pass this on? What are we fundamentally saying? So my question is, you know, what is the policy framework that can still enable some kind of profit, even for the dormitory operator, if it's not the state? If it's the state, all the better, right? But without leading to a situation that enables large profits at the expense of a fundamental public good and public health need. That's number one. I think that's not even medium term. That's probably, you know, for long term. And how much to subsidize the costs that are within the state control to dictate land costs and so on for the dormitories? I'm talking still coming back to accommodation. Where do they live? Where do we put them when they need to sleep, when they need to relax? You know, where do they go? You know, at the end of work, they're not just workers. They live here, even if it's only for 2 years. And then the other thing has to be this question of social integration. Now, the structural issues include the fact that they are excluded in very fundamental ways from the places they dwell. I know that sounds ironic. For example, they live at Kaki Bukit, where my parents live. They do. You see them around, but they're not in any other way integrated. They're just left to lounge because their accommodation is rather crowded. They will come out. They will need to. Some of them do drink. This, of course, they will drink. For example, they will, in other words, liquor, right? And then they don't have anywhere to go, right? So that's one thing. Let's talk about everyday on the ground situations, right? So what is happening on the ground? That's something that we have to address in the medium and long term. Where do they go for recreation? Where do they go to relax? They're just human beings like us. They also need some place to you know, de-stress. But more importantly, if you talk about a perspective of the built environment as a text, you know, the city as a text, the place as a text, then you can also talk about the intertextual understanding or reading or literacy of place. And what do I mean by that? There are other supporting texts. How are they represented, not represented, misrepresented in media, in school, in the ways we celebrate our achievements? Are they part of us or not? Why are they, if they're excluded, why? Maybe National Day, do they have a float? I'm kind of half joking here. You know what I mean? The visibility is important because not only do we not see them, or we see them only in a negative light, we don't see them in celebratory modes. And that's where I think I want to end off with 3 points about people-to-people links. So that float was just a joke because it's not very people-to-people. It's very, you know. But let's talk about people-to-people. You have, for one thing, place-based people-to-people links. Again, coming back to Kaki Bukit because I'm familiar with it. Kaki Bukit is Bedok Reservoir Road, that area, not facing the reservoir. So, for example, the folks who, the workers who live at Kaki Bukit dormitories behind the factory area, they go to the mosques. At least the Muslims, they will attend the nearby mosque for example, Hari Raya prayers. Of course, we're not going to have it this year, but you know, so they're integrated through this one point. And maybe other points. How are they integrated into the place they live in, for example, right? How are they integrated in whatever way that life integrates you into a place? As Singaporeans and as them, we need to ask also a second point. What is their own wish? What do they want to involve themselves in? We can't say you must now be involved in this program because it's an integration program. That's even worse. We must ask what and who they are and what they want. It's up to them, right? But if they want to, they can. But right now they can't, rather. And the third one is event-based, not just place-based or wishes-based, but also or needs-based, but also event-based inclusion in the form of, you know, I mentioned earlier celebration, half jokingly, but also informal events in the area. You know, you've got your CCC, you've got your RC, you've got all sorts of things, right? Are they ever involved? They live there. Yeah. That's the longer term. That's very idealistic, I know, but hopefully longer term.
Imran, thank you very much. Some of it is happening. We see small clusters of migrant workers appearing for National Day and that, but integration, I think certainly academics have to really come in and unpack what we mean by integration. When we want communities to be more involved with each other, how do we do that? I think that's very important, that has been raised. And I love what you have said, making visible the invisible. I think that's very core to how we go forward, and how we don't have all these camps and clusters and everything else, and even give COVID-19 infection rates as from this group who are so, because the virus is, by the way, non-discriminatory, and all the rest. Okay, last part of questions that I'm picking up from people is, one of it is some are academic, they're asking me about ASEAN. I'll put that, sorry dear, whoever the participant asks, if we can, we'll squeeze that in, but I'll go back to some of the core questions that have come. Everything is core, by the way. Sorry, this one is the role of the media, and I think perhaps maybe Satveer, you would like to explore that, and maybe anyone else, all sharper and shorter, because I've just asked Harpreet for our technical expertise from Shape C for another 10 minutes. And the last part, and the last one, funds. Do the NGOs right now have funds? And the last question I have is, how do the NGOs, what is the relationship between the NGOs and the government in this core area? A pandemic is one. A pandemic can happen again. Nobody wants it, but it can be another form of an emergency. So what is the relationship between the government, their respect given to NGOs for their views, or is there a structural approach even to engaging the NGOs / CSO, civil society organizations? Open forum, anyone can jump in first. Please do so.
May I just touch on?
Yes,
I'll just start with with Imran's little point about spaces, leisure spaces for migrant workers. It's actually part of that same problem that I was trying to put out there, that we have a certain economic model for Singapore, where we want to reserve as much of the wealth for Singaporeans and give as little as possible to the foreign worker. But it's the same thing about space. We want the foreign worker here to do work, but we want them to have as small a footprint as possible on our land, on our space. So they are squeezed into concentrated dormitories, and they're not supposed to share our leisure spaces, our entertainment spaces, and so forth. That's why you see what you are seeing. It's the same philosophy, all right? As tiny a space, as tiny a wealth share as possible for the foreigner, as much as possible for ourselves. We need to question that. Now, and then I come to the second question from Braema. The trouble here is that when we start to question prevailing policy and prevailing ideologies, you know, it's really difficult for people who have vested interests in the prevailing. And this actually characterizes a lot of the relationships between the state and non-state actors, including maybe questioning media, NGOs, civil society, and so forth. So while we are welcome as helping hands to just, you know, give out masks and give out hand sanitizers and all that, it's a lot harder for those with vested interests to accept the fact that we also have a voice, we also have our thoughts, we also have our critiques. And therefore, there tends to be a lot of tension whenever we venture into these unwelcome areas, including a webinar like today. So, you know, so I think Singapore really needs to grow up, because unless we do, we are never going to be able to critically re-examine ourselves, reflect or learn or adapt.
Yep, thank you. Are you okay on funding? Do you have funding right now? Is there a state to NGO funding with no strings attached? No strings.
It would be nice to have state funding, but given the nature of the state, is that really funding, or is that called leverage?
Okay, thank you. Jaya, anything on funding and CSO and government relations?
Yeah, I'll just sort of address all these points collectively. You know, because I mean, now's the time where we kind of need all hands on deck. You know, I guess whoever is able to render help should be able to render help. I guess, you know, there is for example, home has been considered a non-essential service, and this has been reported. So, you know, there maybe has to be more inclusivity in the kinds of people that is being allowed to sort of get access to the migrant workers and to various situations that are happening on the ground. I'll just like to touch on media, and maybe Satveer can say more about this later, is that it is important for there to be, you know, open, transparent reporting, you know, for people to be able to speak up without fear. I guess a common thread also that has been sort of articulated in the forum is that a lot of migrant workers are afraid. They're afraid to say certain things because they don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to have repercussions and all of that. So the openness and the transparency is very, very important. I don't think any of the media is really going into the dorms at this point. So, you know, so we're hearing things from migrant workers themselves who are sending photos, sending pictures and all of that. In terms of funds, right now, you know, we are getting, I think all NGOs are doing their respective fundraising. So, you know, we are getting a lot of help from the ground with regards to money. And well, what I'll say is that, you know, it's great that the money is coming in, but we really need to ask ourselves why do we need, you know, all this financial assistance and all this monetary help at this point here.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, it is almost 12:10, so I need to wrap up, and therefore I would like to say, wherever you are, participants, you can please give a big applause to our 4 wonderful speakers, because I think they have shared a lot on the state of migrant workers in Singapore. Could we do that, please? And we have talked about, just to summarize, I think we have talked about restructuring, deconstruction and restructuring, the land, the sharing of wealth, the living spaces. I think that's very core. How are we going to go forward for long term? What do we mean by, I'm just doing the bigger strokes. What do we mean by essential workers? This pandemic has shown us who are the people right at the front line, and therefore what are the living wages? There needs to be a whole restructuring of what we mean by living wages, both for migrant workers as well as for our own people, meaning Singaporeans. And valuing, the last part, that are valuing migrant workers as persons, human beings. We sometimes even make careless mistakes of thinking that just because they can't speak English like how we do, and some of us do not even speak good English, so to speak, therefore the intellect is warped. I think that is that is an awful grave mistake. And they are smart people who have taken a lot of courage to come here to work. And we have to recognize and accept the different cultures. We are a hotspot for multi-cultures living together, multi-faiths. It's an extendability, it's a scalability that we need to look at, such that we see them as workers rather than foreign worker. I would like to drop that word foreign personally and just go to migrant workers, different forms of people helping to restructure and build up our country, as well as helping their own country to build up and building up their own families and villages. So the pandemic is non-discriminatory. It has many spores and it is looking for hosts. We are non-discriminatory and we have to put down the right approaches to helping all of them. So with that, I would like to thank Sheikh C for being wonderful in the technical support. Apologies if not all the questions have been answered. You can email MARUAH, I will try to answer. I've asked whether we can share the PowerPoints on MARUAH website. I'll sort it out with the speakers. But to one and all, a wonderful, I go back to the same thing, a wonderful, meaningful Labor Day. So with that, bye for now, everyone. Bye-bye. And speakers, would you like to say bye-bye?
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all. Okay.